Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're diving into the massive 300-year story of the British Empire. But, we're not just going to do the standard kings, queens, and battles history lesson. Nope. Instead, we're going to look at this incredible expansion like it's the life cycle of a giant global business. Think of it as a massive corporation that saw absolutely explosive growth, hit total market dominance, and then, well, eventually got way too expensive and literally mathematically impossible to keep afloat. So here's our roadmap. We're breaking this imperial life cycle down into 4 phases. First, the growth phase with the mercantilist First Empire. Second, losing America and pivoting east. Third, the peak era of Pax Britannica. And fourth, decolonization and economic collapse. Just to keep our bearings, let's look at this timeline anchoring us across roughly 400 years. We're starting way back in 1607 with Jamestown being founded. We hit that major roadblock in 1783 with the loss of the American colonies. Then we absolutely soar to global dominance from 1815 to 1914 during Pax Britannica, and finally face rapid decolonization after 1945. Seeing the whole shebang laid out like this really highlights the sheer scale of cause and effect we're talking about here, right? Before we jump into the early economic engines. All right, Phase 1, the Mercantilist First Empire. Subtitle, Building the Machine. This whole era kicks off with early English settlements in North America and the Caribbean, places like Jamestown in 1607. And the absolute foundation of all this? Mercantilism. If you're wondering what that means in practice, think of it as strict, state-sponsored economic protectionism. The goal was super simple: maximize your exports, minimize your imports, and essentially act like a ruthless corporate monopoly designed to funnel wealth from the very edges of the globe straight back to London. This setup created a brilliantly efficient closed-loop supply chain. Step 1. The colonies exist purely to supply incredibly cheap raw materials. Step 2. Britain's domestic industries take those materials and manufacture finished goods. And step 3, the colonies act as captive, locked markets. They were legally forced to buy those finished goods back, and only from Britain. Honestly, it was just a massively lucrative business model for the Home Office. But of course, that brings us to Phase 2, losing America, pivoting east, the Great Transition. Now, there is some profound historical irony right here, because those very strict restrictions on manufacturing and trade, the exact mercantilist policies designed to lock in British wealth, those are exactly what fueled the massive colonial grievances that caused the American Revolution. By locking down trade so tightly, Britain basically triggered a hostile takeover, and it literally cost them the American colonies by 1783. Losing America was, as you can imagine, a massive shock to the system. So what did they do? They pivoted. We see a huge transition from the First Empire, which was heavily focused on the Americas, the Caribbean, and that strict Atlantic trade, over to the Second Empire. Britain expanded its footprint deep into Asia and Africa. They shifted away from those locked Atlantic markets to a truly global operation. And that pivot perfectly sets the stage for our third phase, the era of Pax Britannica, the climax of global hegemony. This era covers the century stretching right from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 up to the start of World War I in 1914. Pax Britannica literally translates to British peace. But let's be real, this relative peace wasn't happening because everyone suddenly got along. It existed because British maritime and commercial dominance was absolute. The Royal Navy was the undisputed, heavily armed enforcer keeping those global trade routes in check. Under that incredibly powerful naval umbrella, the empire's expansion just went into absolute hyperdrive. They added a staggering 10 million square miles of territory. 10 million! To put that number into perspective, that is roughly the size of the entire North American continent, just absorbed into a single geopolitical entity. But here's the really crucial part. They didn't just rule by planting a flag and sending in troops. The pillars of this absolute peak included what historians call the informal empire. This meant they had deep financial influence and mercantile control over nations that were technically independent. It's kind of like a modern holding company, right? They controlled the purse strings, the shipping lanes, and the global markets, often without even needing boots on the ground. But looking at that staggering global scale leads us to a massive, unavoidable question. How in the world do you actually pay to police, administer, and defend an extra 10 million square miles scattered across the entire planet? Which brings us to our fourth and final phase, decolonization and economic collapse. The bank runs dry.
Entering this era, the narrative completely shifts. We go from unmatched global dominance to, well, crushing ledger books. You see, the collapse wasn't just some big military defeat. It was this intense dual-front struggle. You had massive internal, non-violent pressure building up within the colonies, crashing headfirst into absolute post-war economic exhaustion back home. To really understand that internal pressure, just look at grassroots movements like Gandhi's Swadeshi movement in India. It was an incredibly brilliant strategy that choked that massive mercantilist machine from the bottom up through nonviolent economic boycotts. By refusing to buy British-manufactured goods and making their own stuff locally, they hit the empire exactly where it hurt the most, the profit margins. They took that lucrative closed-loop cycle we talked about and made it totally unprofitable.
The contrast between the Pax Britannica era and the post-World War II reality is just wild to look at. During the peak, national wealth was running at a massive surplus, right? The strategy was pure expansion, and the military costs were totally sustainable. But post-1945, that huge surplus turned into a crushing national debt. Expansion instantly flipped to rapid decolonization, and the military costs of global rule, they became mathematically unfeasible. Ultimately, the bank just ran dry. While grassroots movements were obviously applying immense, crucial pressure, the actual pragmatic trigger for the rapid dissolution of the empire was just pure financial exhaustion. It really makes the end of this massive global superpower as much a story about stark accounting as it is about shifting ideologies and political independence. Simply put, they just couldn't afford their own overhead anymore.
So as we wrap up this explainer, looking at this history leaves us with a really compelling question about our world today. When we see modern superpowers projecting power and keeping military bases all over the globe, you kind of have to wonder, are they immune to those crippling financial costs? Or will the sheer, overwhelming financial gravity of global reach always pull an empire eventually back down to earth? Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.